Okay, so you've sent over some source material on a really heavy topic.
Mm-hmm.
The persecution of Christians in Nigeria. It's a devastating humanitarian crisis, obviously. Huge political dimensions, too.
It really is. We're talking horrific violence, displacement. It's a major human rights catastrophe, especially in areas like the Middle Belt. The scale is just immense.
Yeah, absolutely immense. And look, acknowledging the gravity is, well, it's essential. But our mission today, based purely on the source you shared, it's a bit different.
Right.
We're not doing the huge overview of the crisis itself. Instead, we're diving into the conversation around it.
Specifically how the U.S. political world talks about it, or maybe doesn't talk about it, according to some.
Exactly. How the engagement or, the perceived lack of engagement from key U.S. figures gets framed and debated.
And the source you sent really sets that frame up immediately. It highlights this specific tension.
Right. So the source title we're focusing on is, Has Trump Been Silent? His Recent Takes on Christian Persecution in Nigeria.
And see, right there, the title itself basically maps out the whole debate before you even read a word.
Yeah.
It sets up this stark contrast, doesn't it? The idea of silence this narrative that maybe he ignored it versus the reality of recent takes, actual documented comments.
It kind of throws you straight into this political argument. It suggests, well, it implies there's already a story out there, maybe a strong one, saying he was silent.
Mm-hmm.
And this article is positioned as like the corrective. Here's the proof he wasn't silent.
Right. But that raises the immediate question, If these recent takes exist, why did that silence narrative gain traction to begin with?
Good point.
That's really the dynamic we have to unpack here. The source isn't just listing facts. It's making an argument about political visibility, about priorities.
How so?
Well, often that silence narrative doesn't come from zero comments ever being made. It comes from the commentary not being loud enough or frequent enough.
Or maybe forceful enough.
Exactly. Not meeting the expectations of, say, certain advocacy groups who are really focused on this.
Okay, right. Let's unpack that. Why is being seen as silent on this particular issue potentially so damaging for a figure like former President Trump, considering his base?
Well, because the persecution of Christians, particularly in Nigeria, it isn't some fringe issue in U.S. politics. It connects deeply with religious conservatives, evangelical voters.
Key demographics for him?
Absolutely. And specific human rights lobbies, too. These are groups that often, hinge their political support on global religious freedom issues.
So for a politician who really positions themselves as a champion of religious freedom,
right,
the expectation isn't just, oh, he mentioned it once. It needs to be a visible, consistent priority.
Precisely. If the comments seem too quiet or, maybe too diplomatic or just buried under other news,
It's like indifference.
it risks alienating that really vital support base. So perceived silence or even just perceived underengagement, it becomes a real political liability.
Yeah. Okay, so how does that liability actually play out? What happens?
It plays out through advocacy pressure. When these groups feel there isn't enough strong public engagement, they, along with maybe conservative media outlets, will really amplify that silence critique. They use it almost as leverage.
Leverage for what?
To push for specific policy actions. Things like targeted sanctions on the perpetrators, or maybe getting certain groups officially labeled as terrorists, or pushing for aid specifically directed to Christian communities.
Ah, I see. So the silence narrative isn't just an observation, it's kind of a political tool itself used to drive policy.
Very much so. It's part of the political toolkit for these groups.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So the source we have, by highlighting the recent takes, is basically pushing back in that messaging war.
Right.
But, okay, let's not lose sight of the actual situation in Nigeria that makes all this U.S. political talk so fraught. What's the reality on the ground that complicates things?
Yeah, this is crucial because the crisis in Nigeria, it's not just one simple thing. I mean, yes, absolutely, there are elements of clear sectarian religious violence. We know actors like Boko Haram, ISWAP.
Horrific groups.
Truly. But a lot of the violence, especially in that Middle Belt region, it also involves these long-standing conflicts between, broadly speaking, Muslim nomadic herders and Christian farming communities.
And the complexity there is figuring out the main driver, right? Is it purely about religion? Or is it really about resources, land, water getting scarcer, maybe because of climate change, and religion just becomes the identifier, the flashpoint?
Exactly that. And that complexity, well, it puts any U.S. administration in a really tricky diplomatic spot.
How so?
Well, human rights advocates understandably want clear action, designate perpetrators, maybe impose sanctions, intervene somehow. But If a lot of the violence is driven by these resource conflicts and historical ethnic tensions, than just slapping a broad religious persecution label on everything, while, yes, partly true, might oversimplify it. It could even harm diplomatic efforts with the Nigerian government itself.
Because the Nigerian government might be framing it differently.
Often they do. They might frame it primarily as, economic issues or ethnic rivalries, not solely religious persecution.
Ah, okay. So the sheer difficulty in getting the diagnosis right and then applying the right U.S. policy tools, like specific terror designations or sanctions, that creates a kind of gap. A gap between what advocates are demanding and what policymakers feel they can realistically or diplomatically do.
Precisely. And that gap, that's where the silence narrative rushes in to fill the void.
Right. If the action isn't immediate or isn't forceful enough or isn't labeled exactly the way certain groups want,
The default charge becomes indifference or silence. The focus then shifts away from the massive challenges of actually addressing the Nigerian crisis.
and lands squarely on the domestic political figure. Did they say enough? Did they care enough?
Exactly. It becomes about the U.S. politician's performance, almost.
Which brings us back to the source title. Has Trump been silent? The very existence of that headline suggests the source itself is, well, it's taking a side in the messaging battle, isn't it?
I think that's fair to say. It's not just passively observing the debate. It seems to be actively trying to correct the record as it sees it.
So this raises a really important question for us and for you listening. If a source seems primarily focused on documenting recent takes, specifically to counter a silence narrative, is that still neutral reporting? Or is it closer to political advocacy itself?
That's the critical lens we need, isn't it? The source, just by its framing, has kind of declared its mission, proved the silence claims are wrong, or at least misleading.
So it's not just reporting on the political discourse, it's actively participating in it. It's trying to make sure certain statements get logged, get amplified.
And that very active amplification tells you something important. It tells you that for certain groups, it's not enough for a statement to simply be made. It needs to be heard. It needs to get attention, connect the suffering over there with U.S. policy discussions over here. If the statement gets made but just disappears into the news cycle,
Doesn't get enough airtime.
then politically, for those constituencies, it might as well have been silence. Visibility is key.
You know, this really highlights that constant media challenge with complex global crises. Often, the media almost needs a domestic political hook like, what did Washington say, to justify sustained coverage of a tragedy happening far away.
That's a very common pattern.
And if the politician's reaction becomes the main story, then the actual crisis, the underlying suffering, can kind of fade into the background.
It can. And this source, effectively, is providing the receipts. It's saying, look, here are the dates, here are the quotes, he spoke. Therefore, the silence narrative is inaccurate.
But the fact that the silence narrative persists anyway shows that just presenting facts often isn't enough to win a political messaging fight.
Perceived priority often matters more than the documented word count.
Okay, so let's try and summarize the layers we sort of peel back here. We started with this incredibly complex, tragic crisis in Nigeria. We quickly saw how the U.S. political response gets tangled in this tension between what advocates demand and the sheer difficulty of making effective, nuanced policy.
Right, the policy complexities.
And then we saw how this specific source title, Has Trump Been Silent?, perfectly captures and maybe even weaponizes that political tension.
That whole framing, pitting silence against recent takes, it's a really powerful example of how sources, especially ones focused on political figures, can really define the terms of debate on huge global issues.
Yeah.
It shows how the public conversation can end up focusing less on, say, is this policy actually working for people in Nigeria, and much more on how does this policy look, what are the optics, what's the PR battle?
So what's the takeaway for you listening to this, trying to make sense of it all? I think the main thing is to recognize when you see a headline asking about a politician's alleged silence,
Yeah.
your first question shouldn't just be, were they silent or not? It should be, okay, why is this question being framed this way right now? Who benefits from asking it or from the answer this article provides?
It pushes you to look critically at the source's likely intent. Was the main goal just to document things accurately? Or was it maybe part of an internal political effort to shore up support for a figure among a key group?
Right. Is it journalism or advocacy or maybe somewhere in between?
The headline itself is like a clue prompting you to think about that context.
Okay, and that brings us to our final thought for you to mull over, building directly on this tension we've been discussing. If the media lens, or the source's lens, keeps focusing so intensely on a politician's reaction to a humanitarian crisis?
Mm.
Does that intense focus on the reaction inadvertently draw our attention away from the crisis itself?
Does it mean we end up spending more energy debating the politicians' words than understanding the horror unfolding on the ground in Nigeria?
Something to think about. Where is your attention being directed when you read headlines like the one we discussed?
A crucial question. Until next time.
Until next time.